Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Gabriel Meyer. I'm the executive director of the Historic Ruskin Art Club of Los Angeles. Welcome to this third lecture in our fall season, a presentation that focuses not on Ruskin per se, but on California history and specifically the story of the family, the Boyce family, and the artistic milieu out of which the Ruskin Art Club was formed in October 1888. To help us with this, we have a longtime friend of the club with us today, Carol de Boer-Langworthy, Langworthy with an A, despite the spelling on some of our publicity materials with an O, which an inattentive editor, namely yours truly, did not catch. My apologies again, Carol.
No problem.
I remember seeing an audio, I think I mentioned this earlier, an audio tape of a presentation Carol did on tonight's topic in a desk drawer in the old clubhouse, probably in the late 1990s. Carol also gave us another presentation, I think, around 10 years ago. But we're delighted to have this opportunity to explore the lively origins, livelier than one would expect, origins of the Ruskin Art Club through the lens of the colorful life of novelist Neith Boyce, daughter of Mary Boyce, our founder, and the late 19th century Los Angeles world in which she grew up. Carol de Boer-Langworthy teaches narrative nonfiction in the nonfiction writing program of Brown University's Department of English. She is the editor of The Modern World of Neith Boyce, Autobiography and Diaries, published by the University of New Mexico Press, and is working, she tells us, on a literary biography of this progressive era modernist writer. Please welcome our dear friend of the Ruskin Art Club, Carol de Boer-Langworthy.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm really happy to be here. I'm not sure you're seeing me, but I'm hearing people, hearing
We're seeing you. Yeah.
This is really a pleasure to be able to talk about Los Angeles with Los Angelinos, because I am working on this literary biography of Neith Boyce, and there are huge gaps of sometimes quite significant gaps that I can only do by kind of being on the ground, so to speak, and hearing, I don't want to say folk tales, but sort of common knowledge that people in a city know, but you can't just pick up from reading. So I'm looking forward to being back with you, and I will be bending people's ears. But tonight we're talking about Mary Boyce, as well as her daughter, Neith, and I will try not to just keep talking about Neith. I have many questions about Mary, and part of that is, well, I'll tell you as we go along. Okay, here we go. So here's Mary. I believe this was taken 1896 or so, when she was the editor-in-chief of all the publications for the General Federation of Women's Clubs, the national organization in New York. So this was a very big job with a lot of responsibility. And I believe this is probably an official photo taken for that body. And we will tell you about her getting to New York. Oh dear, this is not in the right order. This is Los Angeles Main Street in 1880. Well, I guess I'm going to be just tap dancing tonight. This is the house in which Mary and Henry and Neith and her two younger sisters lived, 424 Hill Street. I think these are not members of the family or anything in this photo, but I did get it from Miriam Hapgood, Neith's daughter. So I believe Hill Street is on Bunker Hill.
That's right.
All right. Okay. Now we're back into it. So this is Neith as a young woman. And as we go through this show tonight, you'll understand why it kind of fits with Mary as well as with Neith. Notice the roses. Mary was very fond of roses. And if we go back to that other house picture, you'll see there are all these rose bushes here. And she cultivated roses wherever she was. So this is Mary at about age 16. She was very scholarly. She grew up in Sycamore, Illinois, and went to the Illinois State Normal School in DeKalb, which is now Northern Illinois State University. And this is the house that she grew up in and that Neith visited as a very young child after various tragedies were happening in the family. So this is Sycamore, Illinois, just west of Chicago, west of the western suburbs of Chicago. And it is now kind of a college town for Northern Illinois State University, actually. And here we go. This is Mary's mother, Martha Lowell Smith, with the emphasis on Lowell. She was from Vermont, as was Mary. Mary was born in Vermont. And Neith described this woman as solid granite. She was very competent and very much ran the household and said some terrible things to Mary at different times. And now we're going to rush right into Henry Boyce. This is a late life photograph, actually, of course. And I believe it was taken when he was General Secretary for the Navy League in New York. He was a Civil War hero and active in the California, I guess what we would now call California National Guard. And very much, very proud of his war record and very respected for it. He got married first time. We're going to get right into this. It gets sticky right away. This is the first Mrs. Henry Boyce that I just found out about thanks to having to give this talk, so that I did a little more digging. I knew that Henry and Mary got married under scandalous circumstances, but I'd never really done, any research besides looking at the divorce papers, which were all these lurid stories. But this is the first Mrs. Boyce, Martha Marie Chapin. She married Henry in 1861. They were very young, and then he promptly went off to the Civil War and was wounded twice and was mustered out a little early, actually, because of his wounds. And he went in as a private. He mustered out as a captain. He may have been breveted to major in the field. But for Neith and Hutch's wedding ceremony, the invitation says General Henry Harrison Boyce and Mrs. Boyce invite you to our daughter's wedding. Okay, so anyway, this is Martha. And Martha had a child by Henry, Jessie. Jessie and her, well, she did stick with the Boyce name. And then she was born in 1862. So she was considerably older, well, 8 years older, 10 years older than Neith. This is little Neith at about age 3. So the scandalous thing was that Henry had been married. Mary was a school teacher. Henry was a school superintendent in Lake Forest, Illinois. And Henry was just, starting the high school. It was all very exciting. Mary's fiance had died, not in the war, but from tuberculosis. And somehow they had an affair, and Mary had a child by Henry while he was still married. And of course, that was the end of the school teaching careers at that time. And they kind of went off together to Vincennes, Illinois. Henry got a divorce in June of 1870. And Martha, was the first wife, was divorced, by which time she'd already had 2 children by another man. So I'd always thought that maybe Henry was just a cad, but it sounds like the 2 parties had just sort of gone their own ways. But anyway, that's kind of small town gossip things that I get into. Anyway, Neith was their first legitimate child. They had a son, Carl, before. That was the first child. And then Mary had a total of 4 more children. But we'll get to that. So Mary named Neith for this goddess, Egyptian goddess, who is called Chthonic. She was like really ancient ones that had a lot of power. And we call her she because the top third is female, but the lower 2/3 are male. We can't tell that for sure here, but that's the whole story. And that probably gave her more power, but she had a female brain very much. And she is the patron of textiles and weavers and writers. And as the patron, she can move a thread and change the course of time or history. So she had some power. And I thought Mary really gave her daughter a name to reckon with. And it's like, this is one of the goddess Neith's powers, parthenogenetic cosmogenesis. You can create yourself. And that's what Neith did. And Mary and Henry did that over and over again in their marriage, partly because of what was scandal that would kind of dog them in other situations. I do need to go back in time a little bit too, because I mentioned that Mary had these 4 other children. In 1880, they'd been kicked out of the teaching profession, and Henry was working in publishing, and Mary had all these other little babies, and diphtheria came through Milwaukee, and the four of the children died within a week of each other. So it was only Neith left. And then there was a baby that then died too. So Neith had incredible survivor's guilt. And her parents were so devastated, they couldn't really comfort her very much. So things were very tough until they got to California. And I want to read you a little bit from her autobiography about coming to California after all this gloom and all the terrible things. What a marvelous new world, bright sunlight, flowers, wide space to live in instead of stuffy houses. The land spread away on every hand onward to the mountains, and oh, the sweet air that blew over the. Okay, anyway, you get the sense. It was just ecstatic for her. Henry went into fruit farming just outside of Los Angeles, and then very quickly got involved in commercial things in the city. But for 3 years, Neith didn't go to school. She just read her parents' books and rode horses and recuperated her health. And it was always that special time in her mind, that was just paradise that she could never quite return to, of course. But it affected her with her elder son later on. So come to Los Angeles, moving off the fruit ranch. And this is their neighborhood. I think this is the Bunker Hill neighborhood. of Los Angeles. So it was right where it's happening now, I guess. And Henry was always interested in publishing. So he went in halves to buy this building and the Temperance Weekly that came out of this printing company, the Mirror. And he and Colonel Harrison Gray Otis incorporated it as the Los Angeles Times. So this is 1884 when Henry bought the building, basically. Henry put $40,000 in 1884 dollars to this enterprise. So anyway, it was, oh, and the astounding thing was they were going to publish every day. So it was going to be a daily. Okay, so I'm sort of rushing you through Neith's life just to give you some idea of Mary's life. This is Winnie Wells, Ethelwyn Wells Conry, I believe, who was a member of the Ruskin Art Club along with her mother, who was a founding member. She was Neith's best friend in Los Angeles, a very good artist. And she did illustrations for Neith's very first book, which was a book of poetry. So she married a judge. As I said, I don't know what happened to my files. This is a man from Boston. We talked a little bit about Boston, I hope, but all right, things fell apart in Los Angeles, and it was partly related to that old scandal. Otis wanted to get rid of Boyce, which he did, and then his advertising manager named Chandler married Otis's daughter, and so they became the Chandler family behind the Los Angeles Times. But I think it was mainly Henry's money from the beginning. At any rate, things fell apart with the boom and the bust in Los Angeles in the late 1880s. And Mary and Henry and everybody had to be uprooted again, and they went to Boston, where Henry bought half of the Traveler, a Boston newspaper, and a magazine called The Arena, which is a sort of a reformist magazine, edited by this guy, B.O. Flower, who was a very influential editor in Boston at the time and up to date on all the latest movements of anarchism and whatever, vegetarianism. He was really on the scene, and they wrote about it in The Arena. And Neith started working with her mother on The Arena, and that's where Neith really learned about editing. And she was just a teenager. So Neith was working and went off on her own to the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. So this is the White Village, the White City, that was photographed by Helen Benjamin Johnston, who then became the photographer for the Teddy Roosevelt presidency and documentarian of the Tuskegee Institute and the Carlisle Institute, and really like an important national photographer. So Neith went there on her own. This was her first big trip on her own. But then she took another trip to Washington, D.C., and through Tessa Kelso, who had been the first public librarian in Los Angeles, who is now in Washington, Neith went to Helen Benjamin Johnston's studio, and suddenly people were putting clothes on her and posing her. And so she was really young, didn't know what was going on, and sat through this. And this one is called The Cigarette. I think Miss Neith Boyce. This may be one that Helen Benjamin Johnston sold for advertising. Tobacco companies would pay her for that. So Neith found her image on a tobacco package and never got a penny for it. So I'm rushing, we're going to be going whiplash fast through Neith's life. Through her skills in editing, Neith got started at Vogue magazine, which was a brand new magazine in New York at the time. The Boyces left Boston for New York, basically, I think because Mary's work with the General Federation of Women's Clubs was just getting heavier and heavier, and she needed to be in New York, where the headquarters were. So anyway, they ended up in New York, in Mount Vernon, in the suburbs, and Neith was selling stories and working at Vogue, and the editor of Vogue gave a dinner party at which Norman Hapgood showed up. And Norman was already a rising famous national editor. And Norman encouraged Neith to apply for work at New York's oldest newspaper, the Commercial Advertiser, whose city editor was this Californian. This is a young Lincoln Steffens at about 1896, when he would have been at the Commercial Advertiser. And he had ideas. It was a newspaper, but he liked to hire recent Harvard grads and teach them how to write. So it was kind of an experiment. And Lincoln very quickly realized that Neith was a brilliant editor and could fix the Harvard boys things. Neith had never gone to college. And so he put her on the desk, and that's what she did, is she corrected their stories. And because she'd been working in publishing and editing, she knew the forms and the protocols. Okay, so this is a young Lincoln Steffens, and we all know he was born in San Francisco, and his family home is now the governor's home in Sacramento, etc. So a real Californian. Okay, so in New York, Neith was living here at this sort of a rooming house that's attached to Judson Memorial Church. And it overlooks Washington Square Park and Greenwich Village. So she called it the Judsonarium. It was for respectable working girls. And that was the purpose behind the first flower festivals, I think, that Mary Boyce organized as well. It was a charity event to build an apartment rooming house for respectable working women. The Judsonarium was sort of like that. And so Neith was at this newspaper, which she loved. And here comes a Harvard boy. This is Hutchins Hapgood. I think he was in the class of 1892, maybe a little bit later. He graduated from Harvard. He bummed around, didn't know what to do. So through his brother Norman, he got on the Commercial Advertiser shortly after Neith had been hired. I'm going to really zip through. They got married, which was a huge decision for Neith, because she was already a successful author and really wanted to pursue art, and was worried about being a mother and having any way to do it. So she had no intention of marrying at all, and basically had a nervous crisis over this decision. And anyway, they did get married. She had her first child, and when that child was movable, she and Hutch went to Italy for a year. And this is the view from one of the places where they haunted. This is from Castle de Poggio. It's overlooking Florence. And it's still there, and it's still like this, only the city is more spiky and the smog is even worse. So it was there, that Neith finished her first novel, The Forerunner, which is the California novel. And this is what I really want to talk about. I think it's her very best work. I've been rereading it, and it's so subtle. And she's in a bunch of men's heads. And in her later work, she's often, the protagonist is a female, and you're following a female's thinking. In this first novel, it's a lot of men's heads. And it's a little puzzling at first because you're trying to figure out which one of these is a good guy, because everybody has some major flaw anyway. So it's a really subtle novel, and it's a story basically it's a critique of capitalism and the excesses that what it requires of humans, particularly males. It's sort of a spoiler, but the hero or the male protagonist dies in the end, basically from overwork, even though he's making a lot of money in the mining industry. And the female isn't particularly admirable. She's sort of heartless. And yeah, so none of the characters are, should we say black and white, where, a formula, one person's good, the other person's bad, and this is a tug. Everybody's a mixture. And you end up finishing the book thinking, Forerunner of what? Because there's sort of an implication of, it can't go on like this. So, okay, and this is typical of Neith's work. It's often not very optimistic, but really interesting. And what I found particularly riveting is that it opens with a description of a synagogue in Los Angeles. And I keep hoping someone will be able to help me find that synagogue, because it's detailed descriptions, and it's the male protagonist, who I said is a mixture of good and bad, is there to hear his wife sing, because she's singing as part of this service. She, is trying to be a professional singer. And what is going on in his mind is like, he doesn't realize his racism. He doesn't realize his anti-Semitism. He doesn't realize a lot of things about himself, because he's just sort of running this monologue of reactions. It's really a tour de force, and the whole book is like that. So this book got a lot of critical acclaim, and everybody had a lot of hope that she was really going to make it, including Neith. But things happen. A lot of things happen. This is Neith's post-nervous breakdown photo. As I was telling Gabriel before we started, Hutchins Hapgood came from a reforming family, shall we say. And the Hapgoods all like to be in on the latest things. And Hutch used a subset of anarchism called varietism as a rationale for what I would consider probably compulsive adultery. And Neith, as a serious anarchist herself, had to go along with it or pretend that it wasn't bothering her. So the real dynamic of Neith's life is this marriage and this tension between art and theory and living. So at any rate, they were in Switzerland, living in Switzerland, and Neith fell in love with Hutch's best friend, let's put it that way. And I think really, truly wanted to go off with Arthur Bentley, and thought, since, we are ascribing to varietism, this is acceptable. And, and we could co-parent the children or something like that. And Hutch went all puritanical and said, it's me and the kids, or not at all. So she would have lost her children. Neith had a huge nervous breakdown. Hutch dragged everybody back to Indiana, to his, home base. And everybody in their whole circle of friends knew about this. And what Hutch did is he posed these photos of Neith with the children to announce to their friendship circle that Neith had chosen him. And no words had to, be passed along at all. They printed, I don't know how many hundreds of these photos and sent them around. So anyway, there she is. She's coming back from her nervous breakdown and having made a tough decision. And this is her firstborn. This is Harry. He started calling himself. He didn't want to be Boyce. He wanted to be Harry. Okay, so remember that kid. And I apologize for all this jumping around, but they moved all the time. So this is Provincetown out on Cape Cod. And the house is the Bissell Cottage, in which the first play that is part of the Provincetown Players was performed. And it was in this living room and veranda here that Neith Boyce's Constancy had its first airing, if you will. It was 1915. Neith had another child. Hutch was working on newspapers in New York. And they started coming to Provincetown on the invitation of Mary Heaton Vorse, the labor journalist, who spent a lot of time there. And so the Provincetown Players were, this group, community theater, if you will, that really had a new way of doing theater and influenced certainly Western drama a lot in the 20th century. And I mean, I'm not making any big claims for her, but it is a really good play, and it was performed on Zoom this past winter, along with two other of Neith's one-act plays. So she'd been publishing novels, essays, poetry, but she always wanted to be a playwright. And actually, when I read her literature, there's so much dialogue, it's almost like reading a play. All right, so this is the birthplace of the Provincetown Players. And this is Neith in Hutch in a play that they co-authored for the Provincetown Players the next summer. It's called Enemies. And it is an argument between Neith and Hutch. They wrote it, and it's everybody who saw the play assumed it was their argument. But it was interesting because Hutch forgot his lines, even though he said he'd written them or said them. This is out on the Wharf Theater, which is like right over the water in the old days of the theaters. So they were getting this started, and Neith loved Provincetown so much that they ended up buying a house among several. This is 583 Commercial Street, which is basically where Neith lived on and off for 40 years, because they moved all the time, but they'd always come back to Provincetown. And one of their other big moves was I don't know when it was exactly, after the whole family debacle in Indiana and nervous breakdowns and recoveries. Hutch's father, who was a very wealthy plow manufacturer, I don't know, Charles was so concerned about what was Hutch and Neith and their grandchildren were doing that he just bought them this mansion on the Hudson, sight unseen, and gave it to them. And this had been Governor Flowers' mansion, New York Flower, I don't know. And Neith and Hutch well, Neith didn't like it at all. She liked simpler things. This is a more recent iteration of the house. It's lost one of its floors, but I knew the people who lived there very well. Okay, so where was Mary in all of this? Henry, her husband, died in 1903 in a car trolley accident in Manhattan. So she was a fairly young widow and didn't have a lot of money. And basically Neith and Hutch took care of her for the rest of her life. Luckily, Hutch's family had enough money that he could be generous, but he was generous. So I don't know at what age this is, but this is Mary, handsome in old age. And this is a picture from about 1924. Mary came from the family, the Smiths in Sycamore, and these are the surviving sibs. This is her older, I should have meant to zoom in. Susan Smith, and there's Mary holding her favorite brother Olin, and this is probably Everett Smith. Gertrude Devine, who was Neith's cousin, the daughter of Susan, and probably her two brothers and a brother's wife. At any rate, this is at Yester House, which is the Manchester Art House in Manchester, Vermont. And Gertrude's mansion, she was very much into the arts like Neith and like Mary, and her mansion became this gift to the town upon her death. It's really a wonderful place. All right, so remember that kid I pointed out. This is Boyce Hapgood, Harry Hapgood, as a cowboy. Boyce, Harry, didn't get along with his father, didn't do well at school, but they were moving all the time, may have been dyslexic, barely made it through high school, and was just waiting for the draft in fall of 1917, 1918. And he was going to be turning 18. And so Neith and Hutch and Boyce had this wrangle going. He wanted to go out, try to be a cowboy. And he picked up a lot of this sort of love of horses and the wide open spaces from Neith, I think. And she knew that, this might be his last chance to try something like this if the army was going to come and get him for World War I. So she let him go, and Hutch objected. It did not end well because of the Spanish flu. And Harry died in October of 1918, I think, in New Mexico. He was just 17 years old. He hadn't quite turned 18 yet. And this was the big tragedy of Neith's life. And that blow is what really kind of killed the playwriting success. And she and Hutch never separated seriously again after that. They'd been separating all the time. Okay, so there were two other kids, the girls, and this is Beatrix, who was born 1910, and this is Miriam, who was born in Florence in 1906. And this is their 1924 passport picture, where you could do it as a family. The two guys are cut off here and put on another page. But Neith is just 50, and she is already a mama of all sorts of people and all sorts of things. This is Neith again in Italy. This is about 1922. She had two books come out in 1922 or 23. Harry, which is this beautifully written memoir of her son, Harry, and of his death. And and then her last novel, Proud Lady, which is very much sort of a ghosted retelling of what I think was Marion Henry's story, which was definitely a novelistic tale. And the proud lady part is the wife who won't let her husband go with his true love. So those came out to high acclaim, and then things started getting harder. Oops, not too well focused, but it is kind of a blurry thing. Neith always wanted to have a house in the country after that fruit farm experience in California. And so she finally bought the Wheeler farm in, I want to say 27, 28, just before the crash. And this is what it looks like more recently. What I found really thrilling about this visit is that you cannot see them here, but there were still the grooves of the raised beds that Neith had to grow roses there. So you could still see evidence of her gardening. So this is in Richmond, New Hampshire. It's a beautiful part of northern New Hampshire. So I said Neith and Hutch were moving all the time. They would sort of rotate between New Hampshire farm in the summer, Provincetown, fall, winters in New York a little bit, and then go to Key West for the really cold weather, and then cycle back and around. So this is a photo of Neith taken in 1940 in Key West. And I cropped it because you can't see it here, but her arm is holding this tall glass of clear liquid. And it was straight gin. She was drinking a lot, and that is something that I'm going to have to deal with in this in this book. That's one of the bigger challenges. But this is the way I like to think of her, and this is her photo for the promotion of her first book, The Forerunner. And she looks like a serious writer to me. So I think I might have one more. Let's see. Yes, and this is another photo from that Helen Benjamin Johnston episode. This is the one that people identify with her very much and say, oh, she was a beautiful bride. It was not a bridal occasion. She didn't like weddings. Okay, so thank you very much for listening to me. I appreciate this, and I would love to hear more about Los Angeles and fill in some of, the many gaps that are extant in my knowledge. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carol. So many questions, just coming up in my mind. One, if you could speak a little bit more about why the Boyces left Los Angeles, that would be interesting.
Oh, sure. I like to gossip. Colonel Harrison Gray Otis, or Otis, I can never remember all his three names, really was out to bust Henry. And so he, in the Los Angeles Times, printed all these stories about Henry's scandalous sexual behavior. And of course, people read that and accused him of having been a bigamist. And I can't remember what the other, it's some other sort of theft thing or something or other when he was treasurer of an organization. I mean, totally made up things. And Henry got so mad that he threatened to fight the colonel, which didn't, the other colonel, so that didn't happen. But so it was really bad because Henry had been trying to run for some public office, and then of course Otis, sabotaged that. Plus the economic thing, I think he had speculated as everybody was doing, and they lost everything basically. So I don't know. I mean, they had this amazing ability to go cross country and just reinvent themselves.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
It would appear. Yeah,
Right.
it's great.
So I don't really know. I mean, there's probably more gossip than and the thing is, it's hard to track down gossip, but
Well, it wouldn't be the last time that the Chandlers and the Otis,
right.
connection would drive somebody out of Los Angeles. Very potent
Yes.
combination. That
Right.
everyone can unmute themselves if they'd like, especially when you ask a question.
Any idea of how they traveled so extensively? I mean, automobiles, I guess, horse and buggy as well.
Yeah, and
a great
train.
deal of time, and trains. It may have taken them a great deal of time in their
Right.
lives actually going from place to place.
Yes. Yeah. And when Harry died in New Mexico, Neith went out to get the body, and the pandemic was just roaring. But in her diaries, she talks about having made all these really good connections of trains. So like she was a seasoned traveler, definitely. But it was trains, I think.
Did she inherit from her mother an interest in John Ruskin and the writing of John Ruskin?
She mentions him once. I remember indexing it. There was like one reference to Ruskin. That's it, at least in her autobiography and diaries. I think she rebelled against sort of the decorative part of all of that. Neith liked simpler things. She didn't like fancy china, fancy wedding gowns. They were kind of proto hippies, simple. And then it was sort of that intentional community type ideal too, like, we got to find a better way to live.
I read a bit of Hutchins Hapgood and have been so profoundly impressed. I mean, that was a great man.
Yes. He truly was brilliant. He felt he was a failure all of his life because he didn't make money. And luckily he kept thanking his parents for being understanding of him. And so it has taken me all these years to hear from a grandson that Norman Hapgood and his sister, the Hapgoods didn't like Hutch because Hutch drained too much of the family fortune. So I don't know if that's answering your question or not.
Well, there are so many angles and facets of sensibility and radicalism, and at the same time, the heavy weight of the bourgeois and the capitalist. The reality is that an awful lot of money supported all of this avant-garde lifestyle.
Yes, yeah, I know. And that's like one thing to deal with. The thing is, Neith's family, family fortunes had gone up and down and up and down. And she corresponded with Hutch's father all the time. And I realized that she was kind of keeping the thank you notes going in the right direction and keeping him involved, which was very smart of her, if you will. I mean, Neith knew she was much more sophisticated about people than Hutch was in a lot of ways. Although Hutch had a brilliant talent for sort of encapsulating someone else's idea or thoughts, I think, and then sort of tagging that. Yeah, but they were both brilliant in slightly different ways.
Tremendously progressive, as you say, proto-hippies, but the free thinking and the modernism, the modernity,
right,
of their hearts, their minds, their souls, the way they behave, the way they hope, things they hoped for.
Yes.
Their disappointments. An extraordinary time. Really.
Yeah. And thank God we have the records. I think their real literary masterpieces are the letters that they wrote to each other, because they were separated so much, and they were always renegotiating their marriage on paper, basically. So it's a really remarkable collection of letters. And then they wrote to all the people in their circle. And so they're, it's just an incredible letter factory that they were operating all the time too.
There's a huge archive of Arthur Bentley's letters and documents.
Yeah, they're at the Lilly Library.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful.
You had mentioned something to me earlier about Hapgood and Ruskin, that he was very interested in Ruskin.
Yes, Hutch was.
Hutch was, yeah.
Yeah. Neith, I don't know about Neith, but you can just see that in this costume, if nothing else, kind of some of the Ruskinian ideas. But am I not answering an earlier question? Did someone else say something?
That's fine.
Okay.
This is Greg Tedesco. I have a question.
Right.
I'm curious about her influence on other writers and how she was received and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, when the Forerunner came out, I think it was this Bookman's publication, named Neith and Edith Wharton as the best two young novelists of the year. So she was compared to Edith Wharton a lot. I think her real influence is in plays, and that is just starting to be explored by other scholars. I think she influenced O'Neill a lot, because her plays got that started, and he arrived there just at the right time. But she's one of the persons who lays claim to having said to the Provincetown players, "We've got to do this play." But I don't know, there are 4 or 5 other people who also claim that phrase. So yeah, I mean, she and Jean O'Neill had the same sort of basic format for the small plays of, some sort of triad, like 2 guys, trying to woo one woman, and Neith's plays and his plays of that vintage have very similar character configurations.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because O'Neill's issues with fidelity and infidelity, and the group with John Reed, all the progressive folks who, didn't believe in marriage and didn't believe in fidelity for themselves, but when their partner was not tied to them, then they would have a crisis of emotion.
Right. Yeah.
Now, what about Mina Loy? Didn't Neith have a friendship with her?
Well, they knew each other in Italy because they were sort of trapped in the same places at the outbreak of World War I. in Tuscany. And yeah, that's a really interesting part of her travel, her diary, her war diary, because Mina Loy was there with her, it was Vallombrosa. Mina Loy was there with her 2 small children, I think, and being very stylish. They sort of were there under that intense circumstance for a while. And that's what made Neith interested in Marinetti and the Futurists, because Mina Loy was there. And, you kind of wonder, like, when and how did those influences rub off on each other? Did they just drink coffee at the same cafe or something? Or, I don't know. It's a really interesting idea, but just like seeming to be in propinquity helps with magic sparkle dust or something. I don't know.
I was curious too about if there was any influence by Emma Goldman,
Oh, yeah. Yes, Emma Goldman was a good friend of Hutch, and certainly of Neith. Neith was a little more skeptical of Emma in many ways, but Hutch really went to bat for Emma, because there were times when he had arranged for her to talk, maybe in Indiana. It was somewhere in the Midwest, and there was a riot, and they were like, people were really going to attack Emma, and Hutch got her out of there just in time. Yeah. So, and Hutch wrote the introduction to Emma's friend who went to prison for attempting to shoot Frick. Yeah, right. So, yeah. They knew Emma well. Emma stayed at their house a lot and wrote to them a lot.
The questions, connections? Well, it was wonderful to see the house on Hill Street on Bunker Hill where the Boyces lived, because that would have been the parlor where the Ruskin Art Club first formed.
Oh, great.
It was in Mary Boyce's parlor that the original group gathered.
Yeah, well,
using some of the same books in which Neith delighted during that time.
Yeah. Well, those 3 years out on the fruit ranch is when she really started reading and her parents didn't give her kids books. They just said, oh, take something off the shelf. So she really dug into some heavy stuff very early, I think.
Did Mary keep in touch with the Ruskin Art Club, do you know, after she left Los Angeles? She would have as the president of the Federation, but did she?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I need to go look at their archives, I think.
As late as certainly as 1893, she's mentioned, in a big way in the first history of the club, which was written by Mrs. Washburn in 1893. So she was a big presence, still for those early women.
Oh, great. Well, Mary died, I think, about 1937. Excuse me. And it took me a while to figure out where she had died. It was the state mental health facility in Brattleboro, Vermont. I think she had had some sort of dementia. And so that was the end of that. But they got her ashes, and Neith got ultimately the urn of her mother's ashes. And carried that urn wherever they moved. And then when Neith died, the story is that Neith's son Charles stuck the urn into Neith's coffin just before they closed the lid, so that Neith and Mary are buried together in Petersham, New Hampshire. But that's all I know is the story. It's gonna be hard to validate that one.
Gabe, or maybe you know this, what was the age of the members of the original Ruskin Club? Were they young women? Were they older women? What, and you know, was it Neith's friends or just Mary's friends?
I don't know, Carol may have something to say about this, but I get the impression that it was mainly Mary's friends. It was a very informal thing. In other words, people were coming over to Mary and to the Boyce home, and they well, two things. They were observing the great library that the Boyces owned, and she was allowing people to use books from that library. But the second, the crucial thing was that Mary was focused on engraving, and on engravers, with the idea that engraving meant that great art could be available to the common person, whereas paintings and originals, were not something that could be that the person of an average income could afford, but engravings you could, and so this would allow common people to have access to great art. And Mary's already concerned, as she says herself in a letter that's quoted in this 1893 history. She says that there are no museums in Los Angeles. So we have to begin to find a way of getting art out there as a public influence. And so she gets very much involved with engravers. And then it's through that interest that the Ruskin Art Club is formed. So those ladies begin to ask her, how can we engage with engravers? How can we collect engravings? How can we mount an exhibition? That kind of thing. And that becomes the initial impetus for the Ruskin Art Club. And that's how then Mary gets in touch, and some members of the club go to Paris, to the Paris exhibition, and see the work of American engravers there, and then bring that to Los Angeles in 1891, the American exhibition, and then that becomes the first art exhibition in the city. So it seems all very much connected, to a project that clearly was something that Mary cared deeply about the dispensing of art, to the public.
But that wasn't an interest of Neith's, presumably.
Yeah, I wouldn't.
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
boy, there certainly are family patterns of concern. And, Hutch came from a long line of skeptics. So it was sort of a family belief, if you will. Yeah, it's interesting. Thank you so much for telling me all of this about Mary, because I knew that she'd organized this traveling exhibit from Paris, right? That went around the tip of the Cape or the South America. Anyway, they shipped them by ship to Los Angeles.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
that was typical.
Right. Wow.
This is widely considered, the first public art exhibit, in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Later on, the California Art Club, I think by 1909, had begun to exhibit paintings. So this became a much broader, and sculpture, a much broader affair later on. The club, I think the Ruskin Art Club only hosted exhibitions for we have a ticket that USC has in their collection from 1905. So I think that looks like around the end of the Ruskin Art Club sponsorship of these public art exhibitions, particularly focused on engravings.
Mhm.
But they did this sort of in the name of Ruskin, but they
Yes.
considered, but it wasn't all the arts. They were looking more at fine art than any of the other, like writing and such. That so
Yes,
it didn't
that's right. That's
draw
right.
Neith in particularly.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that was at the Crocker Building downtown originally. That
Mhm.
they had this
Mhm.
this exhibition.
Did
It,
Neith?
you know,
Yeah.
it was also, you know, of course, connected to the idea that there were no museums in Los Angeles at this point. So many of these clubs were trying to, in effect, organize traveling, you know, exhibitions of sorts.
And actually, it was a very interesting time because when the major homes were built, people did bring art around the Cape to decorate their homes, and they brought not just engravings, they brought major paintings,
Yeah.
sculptures. And,
Yeah.
and
Right.
if you go to some of the historic houses like the Banning House, there are major paintings in there that
Yeah.
came around the Cape.
Hmm.
So, and they traveled, you know, the port was formed at that time. And so that was an important part of travel. The stagecoaches were still in play, and they were creating the connections to the railroads in the 80s.
Mhm.
So it was new and an exciting time to travel on the railroad, for sure, because the Southern Pacific was just coming into Los Angeles. And
Yeah, exactly. It was the
a lot
connection.
of little railroads were built that don't exist today, so that they could go into quarries and bring building stone into Los Angeles to build. So that was that actually, the building stone was the second largest industry in California, next to gold in the 1860s.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah,
Huh. Hmm.
lot of good history in Los
Right,
Angeles at that
right.
time.
Yes.
But it was also interesting to hear that Neith went to the 1893 exhibit in Chicago,
right.
because that really was where a lot of influence comes
Yes.
from what was new and what
Yeah.
writers and artists were doing at the time.
Right. Yeah.
But she never went to Europe, I guess.
Oh, they went to Europe all the time after she
They
got
did.
married. Yeah. Yeah. She did, but not, you know, her birth family. They didn't go to Europe.
And what happened? Did Mary live in the house on Hill Street continuously?
I don't know.
Do you know anything about that, Gabe? Because it's a parking lot now,
Oh.
parking garage.
Yeah.
Oh.
No, well, they moved from LA with
Right. I mean, they
Yes.
weren't.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah,
Neith
so
was living there.
yeah,
but
so she was in New York and Vermont.
Mary was.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, if Mary was living in New York, but the club still existed.
The club
So-
still existed right after she left, right? It was carried on, which is interesting.
Exactly. Why did she leave? That's another story.
Well, I think Carol said something. She left really because of the scandal that emerged that drove Henry out of Los Angeles, out of ownership of the
Yeah,
LA Times.
that's
So
right.
that
I know
obviously
that.
then they went to New York, and then Mary was very, as Carol pointed out, very involved in the Federation of Women's Clubs. That really
Yeah,
became
I understand that. Yeah. Yeah.
As I recall, there was some friction between the Otis Chandler family and the Banning family too, in terms of economic dominance of Los Angeles. I can't remember that bit of history, but I think there is something there.
Well, in more recent days, that they were very involved in the restoration of the Banning House. I can tell you that. Mrs. C was right there with Mrs. Banning to put it together, but you know, it was the Titans of Los Angeles. They were city building, and it is an interesting history of who had dominance, why the port ended up in San Pedro was because of Banning where instead of in Santa Monica. But
Right. Yeah, I remember that bit. And Banning sort of founded that that railroad corridor up to downtown
yeah,
Los Angeles.
it's a corridor and there are cities on each side. So it's but it's still part of Los Angeles, Wilmington and San Pedro and the port, the clogged up port with oil all over it right now. So
Yeah.
terrible.
Oh, dear.
Well, I'm afraid I have dinner guests about to come over, so I'm going to sign off with a big thank you, and you have inspired me to try to do some more reading. Thank you very much, Carol.
Oh,
Appreciate
you're very welcome. My pleasure. Thank you for
Okay.
listening.
Always.
Neat.
And we didn't even touch on what was the music at that time, Greg.
To be continued, I like to say.
Exactly.
Yes,
Good
always
to
more.
see you all.
All right.
Good night. I'm leaving
Good
as
night.
well. Good night.
Right.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Well, we'll let Gabe make a few comments before we sign off.
Right. So certainly we want to thank Carol for unpacking for us tonight some of the more colorful aspects of Ruskin Art Club origins and, and for introducing us to Neith Boyce. You can find out more about all this in the Modern World of Neith Boyce, Autobiography and Diaries, which Carol edited, published by the University of New Mexico Press, and on the website www.neithboyce.net. Our September events are all up on the YouTube channel, so be sure and let people know who may have missed our September events that they're up, and they're up on the YouTube channel. And of course, consider subscribing, please, when you visit the site. Our next event is on Saturday, not Thursday, Saturday, October 23rd at 6 p.m. A collaborative event with the Craft Contemporary Museum here in Los Angeles. 3 Southern California poets, Natalie Graham, Sarah Borjas, and F.W. Brown, will read poems in response to the art of Mufat Takadiwa on exhibition at the museum. Takadiwa is a Zimbabwean artist who transforms post-consumer waste into intricate sculptures and wall hangings. This event will be hosted by poet and series curator Brendan Constantine. Also note the second in a series of lectures at the Gamble House in Pasadena on the spirituality of architect Charles Green. You can find out that's on October the 16th on Saturday. More about that at www.gamblehouse.org. Speaking of websites, please visit ours, www.ruskinartclub.org, for membership information, Ruskin resources, more historical information about the club. And while I would urge membership simply on the basis that we are a convivial bunch, memberships and donations also allow us to continue to offer all our programs to the general public free of charge. So please join us. Thanks again to Carol, and see you all on the 23rd. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you, Carol.
You're welcome.